Welcome everyone to a special event on unpacking resilience with insights and reflections from 6 incredible changemakers. I'm a first-generation settler speaking today from unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory in what is now known as Ottawa. I moved to Canada when I was about 9 years old. My parents are from South India, and I want to humbly acknowledge the privileges I have as a settler, and like all settlers, that I'm a guest on this land. My name is Vinod Rajasekaran. I'm publisher and CEO of Future of Good. Future of Good is a fast-growing digital publication, and our mission is to enrich changemakers every day with smart coverage of the social impact world. In 2 short years, we've become a valuable source of stories, analysis, news, and commentary that equips thousands of changemakers with actionable insights that help them stay current, stay knowledgeable, and improve their ability to do good in the world. And our members have our entire content library at their fingertips, free access to digital summits and a pan-Canadian changemaker community that they can connect with anytime. We introduced memberships a little over a year ago in late January 2020, and we now have over 2,000 members from across the country working in a range of organizations and issue areas, from nonprofits, charities, to corporate citizenship teams at companies, global development and humanitarian NGOs, grant makers, philanthropic organizations, impact investors, social finance entities, associations, cooperatives, social enterprises, and much more. So thank you for joining us today and for using Future of Good as a professional resource for you and your team. If you're not yet a member, watch out for the links in the chat, and there's an email invitation to following this event as well, with an exciting invitation to join. I'm thrilled to host these speakers today, folks who bring a range of perspectives on resilience and navigating organizational transitions. Let me quickly introduce them. We have Doug Pawson, Executive Director at End Homelessness St. John's, Jess Tomlin, Co-CEO of Equality Fund, Justin Weeb, Lead for Indigenous Youth Programming at MasterCard Foundation, Catherine Hay, President and CEO of Kids Help Phone, Rebecca Darwin, Working Group Member with the Foundation for Black Communities, and Sydney Piggott, Director of Community Engagement at Elevate. Welcome, everyone. Let's talk about why we're here today. Now, we've got a breadth of perspectives and organizations and people from across the country joining us. We're here because, in the past year or so in particular, we can feel that our teams, our organizations, and our work, it's all changing in a significant way. And we're here because we want our teams to thrive coming out of this pandemic. And so much has transpired since the pandemic began, and all of these things have challenged and changed social purpose organizations in small and significant ways. And in all of Future of Good's coverage over the last year and a half of all of the challenges, the changes, and the extraordinary response work from across the social impact world, this word resilience kept popping up. And it started showing up in how people described their teams, how funders described their grantees, how charities were being described by donors, how service providers describe vulnerable populations and people they serve. It's showing up in federal budgets. It's now in election campaigns and platforms. But what does resilience mean, really? And what does it mean to be a resilient organization, especially in the context of the pandemic and all that has emerged? Is it just a label? Is it something more significant? Will funders and donors judge teams on this notion of resilience? Is there now an expectation to be a resilient organization? Do we even want organizations to be resilient? Or is that another word for doing more with less? There are so many questions on the table. And at Future of Good, we felt that now is the time to dive into this. As changemakers gear up for the fall, what this notion of resilience might mean in the months ahead for the social impact world. And all of them spoke at various Future of Good events in the past year or so. So we're super excited to have them back. They're going to be doing 2 things. First, sharing one of their most significant learnings, navigating their missions and teams through the last year and a half. And second, explore this notion of resilience with us together and what significance it may or may not hold for social purpose organizations moving forward. Before we begin, I want to quickly speak to the principles of this gathering today. Future of Good strives to be a platform and community where everyone feels like they belong. And I want to recognize and acknowledge my privilege in hosting today's conversation. And the principles under which we're hosting this are respect, authenticity, solidarity, listening, and openness. And that means whether you're on the panel or listening in, bring your curiosity, be respectful of someone's perspectives and lived experiences. There's a lot of tension already out there in the world, so there's no need to be rude, whether you're on the panel or in the chat. This is all about building bridges, not walls, as we say often on the team. We're all here to learn, unlearn, and grow together. So with that in mind, let's dive in. I want to kick us off with this word resilience itself, a word that seems to be, everywhere now, and not a week goes by where I don't hear it, in our conversations with members and readers. So the question is this: what are some ways the word resilience has come up in your work or sector in the last 16, 17 months since the pandemic began? And Kathy, maybe we'll kick off with you. In your work at Kids Help Phone, running a 24/7 e-mental health service, how has the word resilience come up in your team and in your work?
Well, you kicked it over to me as chatty Kathy, so I'll try not to get you behind the time right from the beginning, but what a great discussion that we should be having today. We have gone through 16, 18 months of unprecedented, uncharted territory with lots of buzzwords that come in to certainly our sector, the not-for-profit sector, the social purpose or social impact sector. And the word resiliency for us at Kids Help Phone, there's a couple of things that come to mind. And then I wouldn't mind just saying something about the sector as a whole. We serve young people across Canada, every province and territory, and there is no question that we as a country are worried about our young people. And the word resiliency comes up all the time at Kids Help Phone when we think about the young people we serve. And so I often would say, maybe follow the young people because they've got a lot of strength within resiliency. It's not a buzzword. It's steeped in coping mechanisms, self-help seeking practices and whatnot. So resiliency at Kids Help Phone is first and foremost about how do we serve those that is our reason for being. And then the other piece of it that I think we really do need to unpack, so it isn't just a trigger word that, hey, we're resilient, board of directors or everybody look at us, is how are we as an organization internally? Well-being is a really, really interesting phrase that should shore up resiliency and nimbleness. So at Kids Help Phone, we turn inside before we turn outside, and it's not been easy. I'm going to just say resiliency is not a switch you turn on and say, hey, today we were resilient. It is an ever building concept, culture, philosophy that is, I think, critical for future.
Yes, that's a great way to kick off. Thank you so much, Kathy. Justin, I'll turn it over to you. At Mastercard Foundation, a significant grant maker in Africa, but also here in Canada. How does the word resilience show up for you in your work?
Yeah, thanks, Vinod, and thanks for kicking us off, Kathy. Two ways. I think predominantly it shows up a lot in the context of the young people that we sort of exist to serve, right? And so, both in Africa where we work predominantly, and also here in Canada where I work closely with Indigenous young people, this idea that Indigenous young people in particular are expected to be resilient and expected to be resilient in the face of systems that weren't designed for us, that don't work for us. And so for me, there's this, but I would say in the context of Indigenous youth and the resilience in Indigenous communities, it's also not like a new thing that just emerged, in the pandemic. Our people have been forced to be resilient as out of necessity and out of survival, again, in response to deliberate attempts to eradicate us and our culture and our way of being, to ensure that our people are surviving and that the next generation will continue to move forward as knowing who they are and celebrating who they are. So I think that's the first way, I think, in the context of young people themselves and how they've navigated both the pandemic, but also sort of the world that exists to serve some and not all. And the other, I think, and Kathy was alluding to this, is as a funder, we work with communities, we work with organizations. And so an expectation or a question that emerges is always about the resilience of an organization to navigate this and to move and be responsive. And so for me, I think what's really important here for at least a funder is in working with organizations, Indigenous communities and other, is ensuring that we create the space and the flexibility and build the trust to allow organizations on the ground to do what they need to do and to be responsive and to be flexible. Resilience is important. I mean, we'll dive into this after. I mean, I have a whole bunch of sort of concerns or critiques about how the language can be used to minimize the need for transformation. But I think there is still a level of importance and necessity for all of us in our organizations to be resilient and navigate complexity. But for funders, oftentimes it means we need to get out of the way. We need to create the space. We need to be flexible and responsive to folks on the ground to be able to be resilient and to be able to meet the needs of the folks they're working with.
Super. Thank you, Justin. Rebecca, how is it showing up in your work?
So in preparation for the call just 5 minutes ago, I looked up what the word resilient actually means. And Google tells me that it's the ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions. And what I have come across in the last 16, 18 months is that difficult conditions is a very polite way of talking about systemic racism, oppression, chronic underinvestment, and exclusion. And so to what Justin was saying, in the work for the Foundation for Black Communities, in December, we launched a report that really showed that Canadian philanthropy was systemically underinvesting in Black communities to the tune of every $100 going out the door, as little as 7 cents were going to Black communities. So when you're thinking about difficult conditions, that resilience of having to work twice as hard to actually not even get half as much, to get significantly less than half as much, has really been top of mind over the last several months. But what's interesting, and where resilience becomes a bit of a magic space for our work, is that we have become the social safety net. We are creating solutions and being self-determined in that way. And that's what excites me about the word resilience. And I'm also looking forward to unpacking that together.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. Jess, you fund and support feminist movements around the world. How is this showing up in your sector, in your world?
Yeah, thanks, Vinod. I'm really in agreement with so much of what I've heard from the others. I think it's met with resentment. I think global feminist movements have been holding the ball for a really long time. And this notion of resilience, I mean, I think the question to ask is, what's the alternative for feminist groups or women's rights organizations or human rights defenders globally? If you're not resilient, what is your alternative, right? And so as much as we try to make it an empowering word and an asset, it is absolutely out of necessity. I was sharing with the panelists just yesterday the work that activists in Afghanistan are undertaking at this moment to build underground networks to support the safe passage of human rights defenders and feminist activists across the country into neighboring countries. And they're being called upon by UN systems and humanitarian systems because those networks are potentially more effective than big institutions. And yet these women predominantly are completely volunteer or entirely underpaid. And yet they persevere, And I say that with a little sarcasm intended in my voice, because when the ball drops, these women aren't going anywhere, these activists aren't going anywhere. So does that make them resilient? Absolutely, but it also just makes them survivors, because there is no alternative in so many cases. And so I've really veered away from using that word because I think it undermines the emphasis that we need to place on these activists and these human rights defenders who are right in it and have no alternative but to fight. And that's the story, right? Do they do it well? And do they do it for decades sometimes? Absolutely. Lifetimes? Yes. Does that make them resilient? Yes. It also makes them survivors. And it also really emphasizes the, as Rebecca was saying, the system that is broken and forcing these folks to spend their entire lives, committed to this work at great personal cost. So, sorry if I come out swinging, but that's where I'm at. That's where I'm at today. And I think, as a funder, I really appreciate, Justin, what you're saying, because I think the shift that we can make as Northern organizations in particular, focusing on investing in global movements, is really like, how do you fund the survival? How do you fund the survival of these activists, right? And that's the difference. That's the change that I can make in my daily life. And that's all about core funding, multi-year funding, flexible funding. That's about using my platform and my voice where it's necessary, understanding when to stand back when necessary, making sure the stories and the issues get the power and voice that they deserve within the corridors of power that I can access, and ensuring that we're doing everything that we can to support either, stand up or stand back or stand to the side, based on the community's desires. And I think that that's a place where we can go in Canada in particular, in terms of how we fund, how we invest, how we support, and how we ally with these organizations.
Super. Thank you, Jess. Cindy, really curious about your work and journey. How is the word resilience showing up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't get to say where I'm joining from. I'm joining from Mississaugas of the Credit Territory, and it's so cool to see so many people, both in physically different spaces, but also just in terms of where we're positioned in the sector, talking about this. I really hope we disagree on something eventually during the panel, because it is kind of boring if everybody's on the same page, but I'm probably going to echo a few of the things that have been said already. But I think I like to think of resilience in two different ways, kind of like organizational or institutional kind of resilience, and then what that looks like for individuals or communities. And I think it's something that's useful to talk about when it comes to institutions and organizations, and less useful for individuals and communities, for exactly the reasons that everyone said, is like, what's the alternative? Is surviving resilience? I wouldn't say that that's the same thing. And, as someone who belongs to a community that does experience systemic oppression, I'm kind of tired. I don't really want to be resilient anymore. I kind of just like to have it easy for once. So I think that that's also why I tend to veer away from using the term when talking about communities, because I don't think that resilience and surviving is the same, as Jess mentioned. And I also don't think it's really fair to expect resilience, because then it's not a choice, right? There's no alternative. So that's why I kind of choose to not use it when talking about communities that I belong to or that I serve and work with. But I do think that it's really interesting and useful to talk about it from an organizational perspective, because it's been something that I've been grappling with, of working in particularly the not-for-profit or charitable sector, that a lot of the times is filling gaps where they should kind of be filled by someone. I always think that our goal should be to eventually not exist. But when you're talking about resilience, it's about bouncing back. It's about being able to recover and continue to fill those gaps. So originally, I thought it was also not useful from an organizational level, because we should basically cease to exist because the world is perfect. But as we know, that's not going to happen. So it's become a lot more important to be able to adapt to change and be able to be resilient to shocks. And we've had so many over the last 16 months, so it hasn't been an easy time. But I think that understanding resilience is, instead of kind of, as Rebecca said, it's kind of this idea of coming back to a steady state that existed sometime in the past. And I think we're realizing that that's not going to happen. So it's really interesting to think about it as, what does it look like for the future? Do we want to come back to this point? Personally, I don't want to. I'd like to see some transformational change that happens. But what does it take to actually be able to respond to those things and to recover? And I think that larger institutions and larger organizations and organizations that are protected by the structure of the charitable and not-for-profit system have a bit of a privilege to be able to continue to be resilient. But I'd really be interested to see, what does that look like for more grassroots or non-traditional actors, and how are we as people who maybe are in institutions with more power, more funding, more resources, how are we actually building resilience for those actors that are actually doing this work and much more vulnerable to the shocks that we're talking about?
Thanks so much, Sydney. Doug, I'll turn it over to you. In all of your work in Atlantic Canada, in poverty alleviation and housing, tackling homelessness, give us some insight into how this shows up in your work and life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the panelists have said a lot of the same things that I was going to try and echo, and I think Vinod and Katie and the whole Future of Good team, just like posing this question about resilience is really important to reflect on. And the work that we all do. And so thanks for raising that, because similar to Rebecca, I went and I looked up the definition, and it was a little bit wishy-washy for me. I mean, I think the last year and a half have shown everybody the deep inequalities, inequities that folks are facing, and the language that we use to describe those folks may be marginalized or vulnerable. And I think that doesn't even do it justice, because those folks are surviving on a day-to-day. If you're experiencing homelessness, for example, you're just trying to survive. If you're at imminent risk of homelessness, if you're a family facing homelessness, you're just trying to survive. And I don't think resilience is the appropriate term. I don't think marginalized or vulnerable is a good term either. And it's something that I think we're trying to pay more attention to around the language we use. But I would say, just like sort of on a macro level, the things that I'm really seeing, I mean, we're moving, we're seeing these big social movements, and they're turning protests into policymaking. And I think that is a really important piece, because what it does is it shifts the burden of responsibility from the charitable sector to be the ones that eliminate poverty, for example, to the systems that have perpetuated these inequalities and inequities. So I think, taking resilience as something that you've just overcome, and we should celebrate that, to saying, no, like, this surviving isn't a matter of resilience. Surviving is people are surviving in the face of oppression, in the face of systemic inequalities. So I think it's really important to reflect on that, the language we use to talk about it, and just recognizing that the charitable sector itself was never designed to, eradicate poverty. And I think shifting that burden back to the systems and the institutions through that sort of process from protest to policymaking is going to be really important in the coming years.
I wonder if I could just
jump in there, and we can everyone just come off mute if you can, and yeah.
First of all, amazing points, and I'm in awe of the courage and I will not use the word resiliency, tenacity and grit. Women, for example, in Afghanistan, have no choice but to survive it. I'm just in awe of it. But I do want to talk about the sector that we work in, because whether we use the word resiliency or not is actually immaterial to the work that we all do. Some of us are service delivery, like on the ground, like Kids Help Phone. But at the end of the day, when we look at our sector, social purpose, social impact, not-for-profit, charity, pick a phrase, and I quote an old friend of mine, Paul Alofs, who used to be the CEO of the Princess Margaret Hospital Foundation. The not-for-profit is a ridiculous word to speak about the work that we do. Everything we do is about good and profit, not money profit. But if I want to talk about money profit, everything we do as well is around filling gaps, as I think, Sydney, you said. And that is kind of the role of our sector. We do fill the social fabric gaps of Canada. And we have done that long before COVID. What COVID did is realize that, in fact, outside of being resilient, this sector is the most nimble sector in the country by far. We do things that the for-profit might be able to do with $1 gazillion. We do it on shoestring budgets, and we do it really well, and we save lives every single day in this sector. So, and we're 10% of the gross domestic product. We employ more than 2 million people in Canada more. These are probably old numbers. So I think the word resiliency, as it relates to our sector, really speaks about our nimbleness and the fact that we're reactionary, and that's not a negative thing. In business, being reactionary is, oh, you're not strategic, you're not proactive. We're reacting to crisis in our country and internationally every single day, and we're standing up and stepping in. I would say the one caveat with COVID that I certainly feel at Kids Help Phone, where we saw 137% growth year over year in volumes to over 4.6 million interactions with young people in 2020. It's 137% we just had to do. Is the notion that steady state is not an option for our sector. For us right now, we're thinking maybe we need a bit of steady state. We need to live within our growth trajectory right now. So I think we're in a really interesting and challenging time as a sector. And I will now stop.
Kathy, I just want to, and this is for, for anyone who wants to jump in, but I want to pick up on something that you said around, doing things on shoestring budgets. Is doing things on shoestring budgets something we should be proud of?
No.
I don't
Absolutely
think
not.
so. I don't think so. But on the same token, we are innovating by far without $500 million of R&D budget, for example. So there is something really entrepreneurial and smart and caring in there. But I agree with you. To our vendors on the panel, I applaud the fact that you want to get out of the way and not be as rigid, because rigidity will be a curse to innovation.
And I think a big struggle about that as well, like talking about resources in general, is that we're in a society that values money so much, like over people a lot of the time. And when we say that organizations like ours that do work with communities that are furthest from opportunity, who are experiencing so many barriers all the time, and we should get less of the piece of the pie because it's less important, I think is really problematic. So even if we are able to do it, I think if we're in a society that values, the amount of money that you contribute to this economy is important. The fact that our sector is so underserved, and specifically, like Rebecca spoke to this, for Black and Indigenous communities in particular, it just continues to reinforce that idea that it's just not as important.
Fully agree.
I think that's something that I struggle with a lot when I think about these things, because it's not just about doing the work, it's about the value of the work and the value of the folks that we're working with. And I think that becomes even harder, I'm sure, for folks on the panel when you yourself have those lived experiences or you identify with that, because you have to be in some challenging rooms and have some challenging conversations, and you can't separate your identity from who you are in those spaces. So I think that that's a different way to think about it. Whether I can do it or not is another story, but just reflecting on how we attribute value to our work, I think, is something I've been doing a lot recently.
And using, saying that, hey, we're a resilient organization as a way to value what we do, that sounds like we're getting into some dangerous territory, because that seems to be like what I'm the last sort of like 16 months of what I've heard is, we're resilient, as people, as a team, as a community, as an organization. And we're seeing, all kinds of people sort of describe, their stakeholders, people they serve, people they work with, people they support, as being resilient and being resilient organizations. But that's not, and as a way to sort of describe the value they offer society, right? So, yeah.
One thing I might just...
No.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
Just go ahead. I was just going to say that when it becomes a new badge of some sort of honor or some kind of something, and I think it's really important for us all to name that every single person is tired. Like, we're tired. We're not just, we're resilient and tired, and that's okay. Like, my personal learning and the learning of the organization is to acknowledge that we also need to rest. Like, we are doing this stuff on a shoestring budget. We need to advocate for more funding. And we also need to rest and take care of ourselves. And I don't want to have anyone in the audience or any panelists, like, we can't just get away from that. We do have to name that this has been, it's like unprecedented. We're unprecedentedly tired. That's real.
Yeah, that's so big. And like Rebecca too, just, leads me down the path of thinking, we were speaking about this a little bit at the beginning, but like the expectations of who's expected to be resilient, and like, I mean, for how long? And, like, whether it's said explicitly or not, like, there are certain demographics, certain communities, largely Black and Indigenous, and others, of course, but, who have been expected to kind of be resilient and wait, like, it'll come, we'll address this, we'll get there. But like, in that, this underlying expectation that we need to survive, we need to be resilient, we need to keep on keeping on, and eventually, it'll be our turn, which is like not a thing. And so there's like danger in that too, where resilience for certain communities becomes so normalized that it frees up, it takes it out of the minds of policymakers and decision makers and funders, that we no longer have to address those root issues, because those communities have become so used to being resilient that it becomes the normal, that this is just how it is. And then we don't actually have to address the core issue behind it anymore, because it's become so hyper normalized. And then the last thing too, just thinking about people within organizations, right? And I think that's such an important part of like, how do we take care of ourselves and each other? And this is not, necessarily the sector itself, but is a product of under-resourcing and overworked and high expectations on shoestring budgets. Organizations might continue to be around, and we've seen many that have unfortunately closed their doors, and I'm sure there will be more. But organizations sustain themselves, but the people inside them don't, right? Like, the organization might still be here, but we've seen, 5 staff turnover. What happens to that person when they're not resilient enough, and they're working in a sector that oftentimes is not able to provide robust benefits and support packages, and then people quit or burn out and leave, and then what? And we kind of forget about them, and they're left to their own devices. So yeah.
Maybe I'd like to just kind of jump in quickly on the notion of value, right? Because we talk a lot about our sector providing this kind of really important value, but we kind of use a very neoliberal lens to assess that, right? It's dollars and cents. Everything is distilled to dollars and cents. But the work that we do, it's so difficult to just monetize that, and the value that we place on our sector, whether it's operating on shoestring budgets or not offering competitive packages and salaries and whatnot, is not something that we should be proud of. That's something that we have to do far more as a sector to recognize that the value we provide is not just distilled into dollars and cents. We're really cleaning up the negative externalities. We're cleaning up messes that systems have perpetuated for centuries. And that burden is left with us, and we're consistently asked to do more with less, and take on more responsibility. And I think so even the idea of value, I think, needs to be challenged as well.
Yeah, I think we're, again, I guess we're all in agreement. However, this, I think, I have some big questions that I ask myself, and this notion that, the sector that's charged with solving for some of the most, if not the most complex issues of our time, is the most undervalued and underpaid. And I don't have the answer for that. I think, Doug, you're right. And Sydney, what you were saying earlier, it's like, this is actually the society looking back at us and saying, okay, here's what's valuable and here's what's not. But, if you're right, Catherine, and we're 2 million strong, then the shift is now, and perhaps there's an opportunity in the moment that we're in of racial reckoning and social justice, and the huge gaps that have been, the cracks in the ceiling that have been shown through this pandemic, and how that has impacted our social safety net. I mean, maybe now is the opportunity to hold high to that value and to hold that mirror up, not to get poetic about it, but there is, we are seeing these shifts, and the opportunity may present itself to really kick the tires on this narrative, because it's not serving us and it's not serving the people we serve.
Yeah, and if we shift the tide on the word value from, like Doug said, the dollars and cents, and on the value of what we do, I don't think I know there is no other sector that actually knows what's going on across this country, from trauma to discrimination and racism. And no one knows it like we all know it in this sector. And so perhaps when we are speaking about our value, I think we need to also touch back to some of the data data and the narrative around it that is very powerful. So when I tell you this data, it's first of all staggering, but also powerful. So at Kids Help Phone, we're a data-based organization. And shortly after the murder of George Floyd, we saw an enormous spike on our platforms of people reaching out to us on racism and discrimination. And here's what we can tell policymakers, which we do, is those that reached out about racism and discrimination were the most distressed people that reached out to us in thousands and thousands and thousands of numbers, second only to those that were fearing imminent harm in their own home. That's how impactful our work is, that they're reaching out as the most distressed. And here's the other piece, is those that reached out about that were also most inclined to talk about suicide. So the real value of being on the ground and the work that we do, I think is much more important to be talked about in those ways than, and it costs us X dollars to do that. That's a business situation that we need to solve for. So that's what was trickling in my head when you talked about value, and also social injustice and the role that we all play in our sector.
I want to pick up on a couple of things that were sort of tossed around here around this notion, and I think sort of Justin, I think you sort of mentioned this a little bit around sort of normalization, right? And this is really interesting, where it's not a new thing, but increasingly, I wonder if this is the way that things could kind of go, where resilience is normalized, and that sort of as a way to like those folks are resilient, or those or organizations are resilient, and that becomes a way to not actually sort of deal with some of the root causes of the issues that you're talking about. Are you sort of seeing some some stuff like that happening? Is that, I'm just putting it out there for folks?
Yeah, totally. I think one of the things that actually ties into something, maybe one of the later questions, we'll talk about it more, but the question about communities that are expected to be resilient or assumed innately to be resilient, because we still exist despite every single effort to get rid of us. I think that we're stretched so thin. Like the communities that we're working with in a lot of these spaces are stretched so thin, just trying to like get through day to day. And with this kind of reckoning that everyone talks about that happened for so many different folks in so many different communities that were already struggling, is like there's a lot more demands on everyone now. Like they're like, oh, tell me what you need, tell me what you want, like tell me what we can do, and often don't really follow through on a lot of those things. So I think almost the process of normalizing resilience has assumed that people have the space and time and energy to be able to talk about their needs or identify them or understand how to do them. And then you're not even attempting to build trust or even acknowledge why in the past people have not wanted to engage in these processes in the first place. So I think for me at Elevate, I'm working on a program that brings more underrepresented communities into the tech and innovation space with gainful employment. And one of the things that we're really looking at from the community engagement perspective is how do we take on that work rather than asking communities to continue over and over and over again to do the work that they really shouldn't have to do. So I think that when a part of that process of normalizing resilience is expecting that people are in a space to be able to do that. And another thing related to that is that they even trust us to do that in the first place. So much of my work at Elevate is first on trust building. And next is like, how do you do the least amount of work to get to your desired outcome? And how do I take on all of these other things, access all of these other resources, all of these power structures, so that that doesn't fall on you again? And I think that's something that's super important, especially when you're dealing with non-traditional actors. So people that aren't registered charities or registered not-for-profits, and really dealing with grassroots communities that are doing this in a really amazing and innovative way, but because they're excluded from this system are not going to be able to access these resources in the same way. So I think that's a big part of my reflections, and comes from that idea of like just expecting people to be able to have the brain space and energy to do this work with us.
Right. Jess, are you seeing this notion of normalizing resilience in sort of your work around the world? Is that a thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good answer. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In particular, like, not only when you're working in countries which are deeply facing systemic poverty, but also, human rights issues. These are organizations that have learned to survive. I won't say thrive. Absolutely under the radar, very much as Sydney, you're talking about the ones who are, still around in Afghanistan, or those unregistered, unstructured, deeply networked associations and groups and ad hoc community members who are coming together, because that's the way that you get it done. And actually, in many cases, the structure doesn't serve them. It actually harms them, and certainly puts them on the political radar of folks who may wish to harm them. And so we actually seek out those groups and have thought a lot about how to support those groups, whether that's, sending money in suitcases or whatever. That's our work to do, right? Thinking about how to make it as easy to support that work as possible, and taking on a lot more risk as the funder versus downloading that risk onto the grantee is a big part of our work. Absolutely. And, I would just say, the story of the Equality Fund is it became the Equality Fund, and prior to the Equality Fund, it was Match. And when I was the executive director of Match, my initial budget was like $175,000 a year. And now the Equality Fund is 300 million plus. And so I'm in different conversations. And it's interesting because when I was the ED of Match, the conversations were like, it was a lot about how cheaply great work could get done, right? And that was the conversation I felt Canadian donors really needed to have. Right. And that's where we were meeting them. And I've stopped having those conversations. I don't think that that's the narrative that we need to perpetuate in this sector. And so this value for money conversation, I actually have moved away from completely, because not only is it a moral imperative, but it is some of the most complex and long-standing work that's required in order for us to sort of turn the tide on our society. And it should be expensive because our lives depend on it. So I think, again, that's part of this sort of corporate, economic model that we are in this moment in time. But this whole idea around value for money is tied to resilience. Like, how cheaply can you do the great work? And I think that conversation is just, I think we're over it.
Right. I've got a question from a participant here that I want to throw in because it's super interesting, and it ties to something that Rebecca you mentioned, and sort of others as well. But the question relates directly to staff and volunteers and their physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. Which, if it's not if it's not the priority, how can we continue to deliver on our missions?
The simple answer is that we can't, right? It's not possible. And my biggest learning throughout this last year in particular is that if we don't rest, if we don't take care of ourselves, if we don't give from the overflow, like the work doesn't happen. The point of like people burn out, organizations live on and people don't. That's why our sector is in the state that it's in. And I'm really interested in creating new pathways, creating new company or like organizational culture, sector-wide culture. Imagine if the whole sector prioritized well-being, and not in a way that's like inaccessible or not actually practical, like go to the spa or go for a run. Like we need deep embedded well-being practices that are respected. And that's counterculture to like everything that we've been talking about. It's counter narrative and we have to recreate it. So that's like the call to action that I'm on in my personal life, trying to live that out personally, because I didn't have models in leaders before who weren't burning themselves out. So we need to build that together. We need to create it and lift it up. When you see it in other people, it's like, that's great. We need more of that. Let's pause and reflect and rest.
Yeah, so much there.
I wouldn't mind just picking up on that because as leaders, it is on us actually, not to say it's not possible, but to begin to venture on what is possible. And COVID was an extraordinary crisis across the globe. And certainly we experienced it deeply in Canada and in our sector. And the demand for all of us was greater than it's ever been. Our stakeholders and youth needed us more than ever. So with the growth that, and I'll just speak a little bit about what we did, because I agree 100% with everything that's being said on here. There is no sustainability if we expect our people to continue to go through crisis after crisis after crisis and burn out and just keep giving. And that is a little bit of the mantra of the not-for-profit charitable social impact sector is we're in it for our heart, we're in it for the mission, which we should be, and therefore we'll just keep doing it. So we grew, we doubled in size. We hired more than 200 clinicians in a year. And so our staff size is double than what it was pre-COVID. In the midst of it, the feeling of burnout, our folks were on the ground listening and counseling around suicide, mandatory reports, not easy stuff by any means. And if I reflect back, drilling down to the simple, how do we keep our people safe, was actually easy at the beginning of COVID. Send everybody home, make sure they've got technology, make sure, we can Zoomorama, all of that stuff. But then how do you keep them whole and how do you keep them well? And those two things were not easy. And I can reflect back where I thought my job as CEO, because they're doing great, incredible work, was to be their best cheerleader, go in and say, you're doing great work, awesome, awesome. They actually needed to hear from me that the work they were doing was incredibly hard. Of course, they're doing great work, but acknowledge right up front how hard it was, and then get on the ground and help them. So we launched a You Matter, we call it You Matter, and we did. I went directly to the board and said, I need money, and we have some money. And that's where the value for money should be spent, is on your people. We launched a compensation review that went across the organization. We have sick days, benefits for full-time, part-time, contract people, casual people. We are going to put a pension into play at the end of this year, approved at the board. Well-being labs, more self-care time, letting people autonomously sign off the platform because they just can't keep going. But none of that happens without an executive team that says line in the sand right now. We've got to do this. This is about keeping our people well and whole, and paying them for their a fair wage for the work that they're doing. They are not volunteers. They're top professionals. And it is a hard conversation to have with funders who do want it on it. You know, what can you do for the least amount of money? Or, you know, don't want to pay for administrative costs, which actually could be more pay and pension. So we are at a really interesting spot, I think, where we could have a little bit of more mojo, if that's the right word, and demand of our governments, our funders, in a very respectful way, like we would, but say, no, it isn't what we could do for the least amount of money. Is imagine what we could do with, as I think you said, Jess, there should be more money. So Rebecca, to your point about exhaustion, oh my goodness, what we have done. But it is on us as leaders to make sure we are more exhausted than our people, and relentlessly fighting for them. That was pontificating, if there was ever a pontification.
Thanks, Kathy. Justin, you had a point, and then I've got a really good question I want to get to.
Sounds good. Yeah, just quickly, I think, totally agree, Rebecca and Catherine, those points. It might be a role for Future of Good in this. Is I think what can be helpful in this is sort of the storytelling and showcasing models and that how this is working. And I think there's a need for that. I think the sector is so ingrained in working a particular way, which we've all talked about extensively here. We need greater sort of permission, for lack of a better way of saying it, to do things differently. And I think storytelling and showcasing models of people and organizations thinking about this differently really matter. And I also agree on, on the funder side, like, I know it's hard. I know it feels difficult for folks, working and because of the way it's structured, just hustling for dollars to do good work. But, don't give funders passes, like ask the hard questions. Make us respond on these things. Because I'll say this too, sometimes we also need to be asked the hard question to be able to push for something different as someone, within an organization. So when someone comes to us and says, hey, like, we need to think about this, we need to think about our staff's well-being, and we need to look at a budget in a different way, that can actually give the program manager, the person that you're working with, permission to raise it up the hierarchy. And it can result in a shift. No guarantees, of course, but oftentimes people need that permission to ask a different question, which is often what it takes to get us to a different place. I think those things are important. And just to maybe last quickly, in some work I do, on the board level as well, for boards to really think intentionally about this too, and how they support staff. Some work I do with an organization called the Circle on Philanthropy. We've done some cool work supporting sort of our staff team through what we call seasonal sabbaticals, where folks are able to go home, be in their territory, connect with the land, connect with their stories, their people, their language, and seeing that as part of fully supporting someone to be well at work, and that not being vacation time, that being paid compensated time for someone to be home and be connected. So those kind of models we need to tell the story of, and for the sector to get greater permission to do things differently.
And it's Justin, you say it like it's so easy, right? So ask tough questions of funders. That's like, even like for someone like me who interacts with funders almost every day, like, guys, like, oh, I don't know if I want to say that. That would just, why would I want to challenge them on this right now? There's an application in process, right? What are ways in which we can, as you say, sort of give ourselves the permission to be able to build that kind of relationship, because there's so much power, right? And the dynamics are not, they're not even. So it's easy to say, ask us the tough questions, but it seems to be so difficult to actually do.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't have an answer to that, like to how, because that power imbalance is by design and it's intentional, right? Like, And so I think you're some organizations might be more open to that than others. Yeah, I love that, the anonymous comment box. Although some funders might just burn the box and not read what's in it.
But that's good. Tough questions, anonymous box,
Yeah. And I'll say just lastly, I do think it is really important. I made this point, but like to assure people, like even giving the staff person, like for example, for me, right, in the case where, I'm working with, an organization on the ground, really trying to make sure we can support this work. If I don't get the question, it makes it a whole lot harder for me to like have a conversation with the people that I need to have a conversation with to get an approval for something if no one asked for it. And obviously want to put the onus on ourselves as funders as much as we can. But for certain things, if I get a clear question that says, hey, you have a policy that says you're only going to fund up to 15% for administration, well, we're in a pandemic here, we need to make sure our staff are well, we need to upgrade that, we need to increase that to this, that allows me to then go out and say this. And I heard this directly from community, this is what they're calling for, and then for someone else in the organization to rationalize a no. Versus just like, this is the default is like, this is how we've done it. We've never done it a different way. So we're just going to keep doing it the same way.
Right.
Can I just add sorry, go ahead.
I think it's also a call to action to other funders to hold each other accountable and to lead the way, and to recognize that other funders are, there's like, have those conversations. I don't think it's for there's a rule for funders to have a funder to funder conversation, as well as community to be instigating. That may help some of the power imbalance. Sorry, Jess, go ahead.
I totally agree. There's funder advocacy work that we absolutely can be engaging in. That's a really good point. And I would say, Justin, what you're talking about is the ambition, right? So as funders or those leaders in the sector, if our ambition is that we have relationships that are trusting enough that our grantee partners can have these conversations with us, then that's a really positive end state. We recently, it's not uncommon, I would say, actually, for the Equality Fund for us to have to be interviewed by prospective grantees. We recently had a partner in northern Uganda interviewing us about our politics, about how we fund, about where the money comes from. And this is an organization with an average annual budget of under $100,000 a year. So that tide is turning, and we're definitely seeing that with, particularly with activist organizations who want these kinds of answers. And it's very much a two-way street. And we welcome it, and I see it as a sign that we can be trusted as funders.
That's terrific. Sorry, so did you want to jump in there?
I didn't necessarily.
No, that's all right.
But I think one of the things I was just thinking of is, and the reason I didn't want to jump in is I feel like a whole other discussion could be on this. But yeah. I think in this conversation, not addressing the privilege that we have as individuals and institutions is like we have to talk about that around how we have those conversations, right? Some of the reasons why I do the work that I do is because I'm a light-skinned Black person, I'm a cisgender woman, I speak both colonial languages in Canada. I can navigate these spaces really well. I can code switch on a dime. I can have those conversations. And so a lot of the times I'm like, this is, it's not necessarily easy, but it's easier. And I think for so many people, that's not something that's easy to do, not only as an institution, but as an individual. So I think just acknowledging our positionality is important in that as well. And I think part of the reason why I do the work that I do is because I recognize my privilege in so many of those senses. And so I'm like, hey, you need to be the one to have that tough conversation with a funder, not this person. And you need to be the one who's going to give up this amount of money and resources and invest it in a community instead. And you need to be the one who's going to have to say, I know I have these objectives to meet, but my community needs something different, and I need to manage that conversation. So I do want to take space to rest, and I do want to take space to ask the tough questions, but I also want to recognize that I have so much privilege in this space, despite what people tell me a lot of the time. On paper, I guess it doesn't look as good, but in reality, I think I do use, I do benefit from that privilege in so many ways, and so many people luxury. So it is a tough balance. And I think that's been something that is a huge struggle, personally, but also organizationally in our social impact sector that is still largely very white, very kind of within the exact systems that are causing these problems in the first place.
Right.
But that's a discussion for another day. I don't think we could get into it today.
Part two, yeah. But I want to pick up on this sort of this, and it relates to this really interesting question from the audience. It has to do with the sector sort of narrative and how we talk about ourselves and our resilience and so on. And so the question is, how can we as a sector change the mindset that society has about the work we do, right? And what type of quote unquote marketing narrative change might be necessary. So ideas, thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump in and keep it pretty simple. It is around trust and relationship in the country, and funders don't step forward unless, in the majority of cases, unless we do good work. So it is about making sure we speak about the good work that we do in a loud way. And I think that's foreign to us. First of all, we want to be a little bit humble and polite, and maybe there's the giants. We're in the shadows of giants, and but it's the good work we do that will enable us to have more freedom to do more good work, actually. And to me, that's the marketing, not being a marketing person.
Doug, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would. It's a really great question, and something that we have to reconcile as a sector, no doubt. Just a couple of examples, I think, that we've experienced. So when we kind of created In Homeless with St. John's over the last 2 years, as we left the city of St. John's and formed our own purpose-built nonprofit. And as we were doing that and developing our brand identity, for example, we had a couple of board members who were, questioning our use of certain imagery. So if you look at any of our public documents on our website or documents that we've released, you'll never see somebody, for example, in distress. Somebody experiencing homelessness looking in distress. And we had board members questioning why we didn't choose that angle. And we said, we don't want to perpetuate, sort of the issue of poverty. We want to show that we can actually overcome this situation of homelessness in our community. So simple things like branding and marketing that the sector currently does perpetuates this notion. Like we talk a lot about sort of the poverty porn in our sector, right? Like we don't want to show any more people in distress. We want to show people succeeding, and we want to see people living happy lives and moving and living their best lives, whatever that might look like for them. And it doesn't have to be what we as a, sort of a middle class society might think. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that we get a lot of feel good, we have those feel good moments when we do something good for a charity. And if we're just perpetuating the same inequalities, then what are we really doing? And I think it's incumbent on our sector to say, like, there are people in distress and we need to support them, and we need to find ways to make sure that they have sustained supports in their lives, but we don't necessarily need to take advantage of that for fundraising campaigns. We need to show what's possible. And I think that's an important piece that we need to grapple with, and maybe a bit unpopular, but I think it's an important distinction that we as an organization have chosen to move away from, and speak candidly about it.
I love the show the possibilities, and I will say we engage an advertising agency, and last year we were given a creative that they were fully behind, a sales pitch to us that was so horrific. Actually, it's clear the work we do at Kids Help Phone. We didn't have to show someone dying by suicide, it was that graphic, and we severed our relationship with the agency. It just was too much for us to, we wouldn't have done that. So your point, though, is interesting around pornography or traumaography or whatever, trying to traumatize people to give, which to me feels very discounting of the work that we all do. So I agree with you on that. The possibilities and hope is more important.
Okay. I want to talk a bit about sort of, there's about sort of this, how helpful or not so helpful this notion of being resilient is in your work. And we've sort of batted around sort of different ideas of what this means, how it shows up in our own organizations. But one of the things that would be really interesting to explore is, if you could change how the word resilience is used, like, what would you suggest?
That's interesting.
Good question. Yeah.
Doug, do you want to go?
Yeah, I think going back to what that definition really was, like that Rebecca provided for us early on, right? It's the idea of overcoming something. It's not sustaining adversity, trauma, oppression. So for me, it's resiliency. If it as a sort of as a term, if we don't use this pandemic as an opportunity to create the systems change that we need, then we're just going to continue to celebrate those who've overcome oppression, and those handful of people. When you think about it on a scale, I mean, it's got to translate to systems change. Otherwise, we're just celebrating people overcoming trauma and oppression and systemic inequalities that we're all working to try and mitigate. So for me, I mean, it's a really important term, and I think there's merit in it. But I think from a macro level, I think we've got to translate that into systems change.
Right. Okay. Rebecca?
Absolutely. We're closing out Black Philanthropy Month today, and a lot of the thinking that I've done for this month is around not using words like resiliency at all. So some of the words have come up on this call, but flourishing and thriving and joy, and not constantly positioning communities and using old narratives to describe the work that we're doing. It's innovative, it's exciting, it's magical, it is like shape-shifting, like it's, there's so many other more creative and exciting ways to talk about the work. And when I get most excited about the Foundation for Black Communities and what we're doing, it's like that. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about growth and what the potential is and the possibilities, as opposed to talking about deficit. We're a sector of true abundance on the grant making side. There is a lot of money to go around. There is a lot of resourcing, and it's just not connecting. So let's problem solve and do that policy changing. And sometimes that means completely shifting your focus away from funders and away from donors and to communities themselves, because that's where the magic really is.
Thanks, Rebecca. Others? Sydney?
I also think that the cool thing about language is that it's dynamic. Like, words can mean whatever we want them to mean. And I think that that's something that I'm interested to see. Like, we really talk a lot about language in our sector and like using the right language and things like that, as if it's like set in stone and we have no power to change it. But it's just a word at the end of the day. So I think that what would be interesting is like, if we could bring it back to a place where it actually does work, if that's how we're going to be described, right? So I think that one of the things that would be interesting to redefine, I guess, resilience, and I won't claim to do that myself, but just putting it out there. One of the things is there is kind of this idea that resilience is like coming back to some type of point where things were stable. And I think that that's not realistic, and it's not the case for so many of the communities and organizations that are called resilient. So I think it would be really interesting to see how that term could be used to describe more kind of transformational change, or things that really do completely innovate the way that we look at our work in the sector and in general. So it would be really interesting to see if we could, redefine the term to mean something different and something that we own, rather than something that's imposed on the communities that we belong to or that we work with. And I think that's something that would be really interesting to see. And I think that I've been thinking about with language in general is like, why not just change it if it doesn't work? I know it's not that simple, but just a thought.
Yeah, thank you.
A couple of things I was thinking about. around the word resiliency. And I think one of the definitions earlier someone said is it's about withstanding something difficult. I paraphrase that. I don't think withstanding is really what resiliency is. That's just steady state, right? That's just holding it together. If we want to figure out a definition that might fit around resiliency, or maybe we should just get rid of the word. But the other thing is to go back to where we were, to me, is the opposite of withstanding for the or resiliency. I mean, to go back, there is no going back. We've just gone through 18 months of what we've gone through. So it is about maybe withstanding so that we can be in our future state, which will require us to have all of these tough conversations and put lines in the sand and say no more on, being exhausted, for example. So that's sort of a bigger thing I've been thinking about. But inside the house, the word resiliency, I don't really think I use it all that much, but the word I do use a lot is belonging. So I wonder if being able to be resilient is how you belong and you get to show up as you are and do the work that you need. So I'm talking internally now.
Maybe I can just add on.
Word. It's a silly. It's a trigger word. I think resiliency.
Even I can just add on to that. And what Sydney was saying as well. I mean, if we're talking about what it's going to take to build organizations for the future that are going to kind of create the conditions for success to really bring about systems change, then that's a different conversation. I think if we want to reframe what resiliency means, it really does mean being able to absorb and buffer shocks and be able to stand in our strength, right? Because that's the state of the world right now. It's extremely complex. It's extremely fast moving. There is a lot of pain. And as organizations, we need to be able to do that. So if we're reframing resilience, Sydney, I'm all jamming with you for redefine it and rename it. I came in I think probably the biggest hater of the word. But I see that. I like that, reframing. I think that's really powerful. And one of the things that we're doing at the Equality Fund is just trying to think about that. It's not about what is the strategic plan to be a more resilient organization. It's not about that. It's actually a lot more about what are the cultural competencies this organization requires in order for us to stand in that strength and buffer and adapt to shocks and really bring about that systems change. And so we're spending a lot less time thinking about our business plan and our strategic plan and how we get from A to B, and much more about really deeply developing the institutional competencies to navigate complexity, to have really strong and acute power analysis in all that we do, to understanding boundary setting, to taking and ceding space, to really, and particularly because we're a global team and many of the team members represent the constituencies of the organizations in which we support, there's so much around how you navigate grief and loss within an organization, particularly one that relates to communities who are really hardest hit. And building out those social and cultural competencies as individuals and as a team, I think is a much, much stronger investment in terms of how we build future state organizations and how we actually respond to and ally with the organizations and movements and activists with which we seek to support. The other piece, I just really want to re-up what Rebecca was saying. Again, this goes back to culture, and so much of it is about rest and pace. We've named this year Pace and Grace, and we're constantly we thought it was going to be Pace and Grace, but we're constantly navigating this polarity and this tension, which is everybody wants us to be all these things, and yet we're so tired and this is so hard, and it's never been harder. And I just really appreciate Rebecca bringing visibility to that, because that just navigating that tension within an organization is so incredibly hard. Yet, if we actually prioritized rest, we would be better at our jobs. yes, we deserve to rest because we are deserved human beings, you know, and we do really important and great work, but we actually do our jobs better, right? I definitely make better decisions when I put my self-care, you know, central to how I show up at the office, you know. Anyways, I just think as we think about how you know, this is a 24/7 lifetime gig. The nature of this work is so much that you know, nobody turns down their computer at 5 p.m. Like, we live and we breathe this work. Many live and breathe it in much more profound ways than others, to be very clear. But this idea that we haven't embedded a self-care culture within our organizations and within our sector is deeply problematic. And I do think if we could strengthen those competencies within us, within our organizations as leaders, then that might start to shift the path.
Really terrific. Thanks, Jess. Others, Justin, Rebecca?
No. I don't think I have much to add. I mean, I think what everyone said, super on point. I guess for me, there's sort of just the language is always so limiting, right? And like, words are co-opted and morphed into something else. And like, so I think it's as long as we, you know, spend the time to be on the same page with people and are clear in what we're talking about, and sort of resist the way in which particular language gets co-opted by, you know, and in service of the status quo and in service of the way things are. I think we'll be better off. I often come back to sort of the language of reconciliation, and, you know, things that was at one point very radical and forward and alternative thinking, but, you know, through a lot of time and, you know, certain people and power has sort of been co-opted, and the meaning of it, the aspirational nature of it is sort of, I think, lost a little bit over time. And so as long as we're sort of spending the time to be on the same page and getting beneath what like one word can try to represent so much, I think we'll be better off as a result of that. So I don't have another word, but yeah.
Sure. Okay, just you know, looking at the time here, and so we're going to shift us into sort of our final sort of a final round of checkout questions. So you know, as folks are sort of, you know, gearing up for the fall and beyond, what's one reflection that you want to leave with them? So maybe we'll kick off, Doug, with you, and we can kind of popcorn it from there. You can turn it to someone.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of the work, if we're reflecting back, I think resides for us in our system-wide planning, just working with community organizations that provide frontline services and our provincial partners that also provide frontline services and funding and have policy, the ability to create policies that can make lives better. I'd say early on in the pandemic, we found ourselves struggling to work with those public systems, and, you know, we've worked really hard and we're exhausted, no doubt, like everybody else, but to work with those and seeing institutions now starting to work with us in new and more meaningful ways, I think that's really been a great opportunity for us. I think organizationally, you know, we've pushed really hard to do that. We've also developed a strategic plan, and I think it's worth mentioning, and in part because Future of Good, you've done some stories on what these look like, and it was a noticeable omission as we were doing it that we didn't take a rights-based approach to the work that we were doing. Like, how can we be a systems-based system planning entity and not think about rights-based approaches to the work we're doing? So just really reflecting on the language, on the folks that we're trying to ensure we're making systems better for, I think is really important for us. So we went back to the drawing board, and to some degree to make sure that we're reframing the work we're doing through that rights-based lens, through that systems-based lens, because we want to end homelessness. I mean, we say it very, very publicly, like, we want to work ourselves out of a job. Not to say that we're going to end homelessness as a condition, but if there's a system of care to support individuals who may be experiencing homelessness and can help them exit that place faster and more efficiently, then that's what we want to do. So yeah, I think that was a really important reflection for us, just working with public systems in new meaningful ways, and just internally thinking to work with right-based approaches rather than just share our mindset.
Sure. Thank you. Kathy?
So reflecting forward, let's say 6 months is what you asked.
Yeah.
I think for me, the forward is not air quote normal. It is not going back. Let's just assume we're at the tail end of COVID. We'll just assume that. I don't think there is a going back. So as you go forward, I think we need to add more care and thoughtfulness into what our forward is, as opposed to what a reaction was to COVID at the beginning. And I think that's really important. It's not going to be easy for us to go back. I just said go back. For us to go forward to return to the workplace, or all of those things will require more care than anything. And maybe to pick up on Rebecca, get rest over the next 6 months and have expectations that your people will also rest. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Rebecca?
I would say lean into the lessons that you've learned individually and apply them in your organizations. I think all of us are at a time have been given a time to pause over the pandemic, and lean into, obviously the call to action is lean into rest, but maybe I'll add to that as like, hold that up, hold your family, hold your friends, hold your colleagues and your peers and your comrades in that as well, and hold them accountable for taking care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Sydney?
Yeah, I think kind of similar to that, but a little bit different. And I do a lot of community engagement work. Something that I've been reflecting on, and folks are also working with communities, is that this has been so hard. Like, everyone's stretched so extremely thin. I think that giving people time and space to really engage with you and build trust with you is super important in work that we're doing. So taking that time into the fall, especially there's an election coming up, and that further complicates that for a lot of folks. So really giving folks the time and space to engage with you and build trust with you, I think, is super important for the work that we're doing. And on that note is, be ready to completely change the way that you're going to work with communities as they step into their power more and more. I think people at this sector needs to be really ready for what those demands will be once they've given that time and space and built that trust. And I can guarantee it will be very different from how things have worked in the past. So get ready. It's going to be an interesting ride, but I think it's one that's worthwhile for sure.
All right, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really top that. 100%, 100%, that's it. Like, yeah, honestly, that's it. Agreed.
Yes?
We're going through this process of teaming and forming and value setting and all this. And one of the values we've identified is radical love. Love for oneself and love for one another. And we can do that because we're a feminist organization, and maybe in bigger institutions it's difficult to do, but having that and rooting that in a core value and being able to practice that is a total game changer.
Super. Folks, thank you so much for making time for this. So many insights. I'm so happy that we hosted a conversation on this word resilience, and there's a whole bunch of stuff that we covered, and I'm not going to sort of kind of name everything, but there's like everything from sort of thinking about how resilience doesn't actually bring system change, to how language can be used to minimize the need for transformation, to what Rebecca called out around a sector-wide well-being and self-care culture, to a whole bunch of stuff around changing the deficit narrative, and the piece that you mentioned, Jess, around ending this way of talking around, hey, we can do great work cheaply, and so much has come up. This is an important reflection on this word, how it shows up, when it shows up, and evolving what it means, and how everyone in the social impact world can begin to reframe this. I'm going to ask Katie Miller to quickly join us. If Katie, would you? There you go. Okay. before we sign off, I want to sort of say this is Katie's last event, and Katie has done some extraordinary work. I worked with Katie back when I ran Impact Hub, and super excited to work with Katie again here at Future of Good. And Katie was instrumental in developing our entire sort of event series, from our summits to our webinars and so on. So so I just want to say thank you so much, Katie, for all of what you brought to Future of Good, and our team, our culture, the standard of our digital events. And you've really given us a terrific platform to kick off the next iteration of all the work that we do. So thank you so much. And sorry, I want us to turn it over to Katie to see if there's any sort of last sort of logistical things before we sign off.
Yeah, thanks, Vinod. And thank you all for joining us today and participating, as well as all of our panelists. As put in the chat, we'd love to hear your feedback on today's events and your ideas on what we should be covering next. So please complete the survey that's in the chat. And also stay tuned for all of our upcoming events. You've also probably seen in the chat a 25% discount code, Future of Good membership. So if you're not already a member, please sign up. That'll get you all in the know of Future of Good's articles, as well as access to all of our events. And also with that, I'll just say, if you'd like to stay on the call and learn more about membership, a few of the Future of Good team staff will stay on, so you can ask any questions you may have. Otherwise, with that, we just say thank you. We hope you have a great rest of your afternoon and day. We hope that this conversation has provided you an opportunity to really reflect on that word resilience, and maybe going back to your teams and really reflecting on how we can move forward towards thriving. So thank you, everyone. Bye.
You take care. Get some rest, everyone.